A bonus look back at Kevin Durant's 53-point performance against the New York Knicks, updating the injuries around key players for the Brooklyn Nets roster, and a historic perspective on what the Nets are going to try to achieve when it comes to the NBA playoffs. It's all happening right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht, not only covering your Brooklyn Nets, but also the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. As we say, going to go back in and look at just a key little stat from the Kevin Durant performance over the New York Knicks. Look at some of these players, Seth Curry, obviously Ben Simmons. We know that Kyrie Irving's absence when it comes to home games is not around injuries so much as it is mandates. We'll talk about post-game comments there as well. And then really ahead of this matchup against the Orlando Magic, I thought with the playoffs looming and the Nets surging, it'd be worth taking a look back historically on what the Nets will be trying to accomplish when it comes to the playoff seeding and ultimately that goal, that purpose that the Brooklyn Nets all came together here, winning an NBA title championship. But we start with Kevin Durant, 53-point performance against the New York Knicks. And the footnote to this was just simple. He was 4 of 13 from beyond the arc in that game, Kevin Durant, which means he was 15 of 24 from the field. We've mentioned it before. Kyrie Irving falls into this category as well. Elite talent in the NBA that also are enjoying themselves when it comes to the mid-range shot. You don't have to look too far away over in Chicago there, where DeMar DeRozan in his resurgent season with the Chicago Bulls is king of the mid-range as well. It's this process that we know the NBA has gone through, the turnover and the emphasis on three-point shooting, the value of it, obviously 3 points being worth more than two, and that's always going to be the case. But in a game where we know the Nets were shorthanded, no Kyrie, no Seth Curry, no LaMarcus Aldridge, who also happens to be a guy that enjoys himself some mid-range touch, it really just made it all that much more impressive from Kevin Durant that he was able to put up 13 shots from the outside, only knock down 4 of them. And I say only, it's not like it's not a nothing burger from out there. But the fact that he was able to lean into his bag in congested opportunities, double teams coming over, no perimeter threats surrounding him on the floor in this game, and still put up 53, still knock down an elite 15 to 24 percentage from those mid-range inside the arcs looks. It just puts the cherry on top of what this guy did in that particular game and what he's been doing over the length of this surge. Third game in the row, win in a row here for Brooklyn, which is obviously important. We'll get into the playoff picture here in a little bit. But the post-game comments are wide-ranging and also important from a micro and macro level. The first and foremost that we'll touch on is Kevin Durant. Didn't come into this game. He said, I'm going to paraphrase all the commentary from the post-game press conference. He doesn't come into any individual game looking to put on a 53-point performance, but understanding how they were shorthanded, knowing that he was going to have to get into his bag early, it really came down to teammates, as Andrea Drummond referenced, as Bruce Brown referenced, easy to get to kind of take a step back and want to watch, but really deferring, right? Seeing that Kevin Durant is in his bag early and saying, okay, let's ride him until we need to make our little plays, until we need to contribute. And Kevin Durant referenced Andre Drummond with the double-double performance, 18 and 10, how when Drummond simplifies his game, he's incredibly effective. He's a bulldog out there on the court for you. He's going to get a lot of those key rebounds. He's going to give you extended possessions. We referenced in the post game how the Nets actually outshot in terms of attempts the New York Knicks, something they do not always do. So I think you look at that game and say, easy, have Kevin Durant go 53. but also have everyone else around him simplify what they're looking to accomplish. And whether it was Andre Drummond or, as we talked about, and we've talked about for several episodes now, Bruce Brown, who in his post-game comments said early in the season, he said it was basically just a mental thing. He was trying to perform the same role that he had performed last year for this team, but it looked a little bit different. And we know that this roster has gone through a lot of different versions, different starting lineups over the course of the season. But even adding in guys like James Johnson, Blake Griffin was a part of it earlier on in the season. Day'Ron Sharpe had his role certainly over the course of the year. Nicholas Claxton, LaMarcus Aldridge. The Nets, even though they didn't go out and pick up a pure number 5 plug and play starter in the offseason, they did bring in more bodies. And that meant that Bruce Brown had to shift his attention away from being that pseudo 5 crashing the boards. And he still is doing that in his game. But as he referenced, it wasn't going well. He knew he had to make a change. So he went into the coaching staff and said, "Hey, we need to switch something up here." And that went back to getting into some more of the guard role that he's had over the course of his career, focusing in on some of those areas, which includes getting on with Kyle Korver, looking at the perimeter shooting, thinking about facilitating. We mentioned the assist that he had in this past game as well. So all of those things track very well to say that Bruce Brown, and if you watch any of, I don't know if anyone sees the commercials that they run on the Yes Network sometimes, he says, "I'll do anything that I need to do to help this team win." Last year, it was playing well above your size and weight class, right? Punching above your weight and doing a lot of the dirty work. This year, it's evolved over the course of the season. And then post trade, when you bring in an Andre Drummond, how are you going to make sure you maximize what your value is? Shift gears. Start to get into the role that the Seth Currys and the Dragic's of the world and the Patty Mills, like they're all there to serve these roles. Playing off the ball, being able to knock down timely shots when they come to you. And yes, Bruce, still leaning into all those things that you did well last season and can continue to be pivotal. As we mentioned, 7 rebounds for him in that game, too. So that was the general gestalt of the post-game press conference. But the other one, after Steve Nash spoke glowingly about having Kevin Durant and what he means to the team and finding a way to win in a game when you are as shorthanded as they were from an offensive scoring perspective, he was asked, Steve Nash, about how did it feel to see Kyrie Irving walk into the building. He said, "Yeah, we were prepared for that." Basically brushed past that question from the media. And Kevin Durant, however, did not brush past that, right? He basically said, not basically, he called it stupid what's currently going on when it comes to the mandate and Kyrie Irving being available to appear in Barclays Center, to sit courtside, but not being able to be on the court playing with them. Joined his teammates in the locker room at halftime, right? So he can be everywhere and do everything except for physically be on the floor. And he made some strong references to New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Said he thinks he will get it together on this. Thinks that, he that sometimes people in those positions are looking for some attention and looking to have a little bit of a power hold, which I think is fair. And then there's also the ebb and flow of just the circumstance, as we've said, whether it's timelines on who's going to return or not return, when we think the mandate will be lifted. It still feels like, yes, that day is going to come. It's just a matter of who blinks first on this. And the secondary piece that I'll just reference, and then we'll move on to some injury updates. As I say, take a look at the playoff picture again. Really want to dive in on where Cleveland is, as we've seen Toronto surging a little bit here. But the last little footnote on this is, remember, the NBA had sent out the unspoken memo, or the direct memo that said you cannot simply take the fines and allow your players onto the court. Now, things were different at that point, something that Kevin Durant referenced as well. Earlier in the season, things were different. People were not sure what the circumstances were going to be, what the risks were going to be. However, information now, circumstances now have changed, and you should be able to be informed by that. Likewise, Adam Silver in the NBA does have the opportunity here to say, Brooklyn, Joe Tsai, you can simply pay the fines and have Kyrie back out on the court. Everyone seems to be in this mode of not wanting to take the responsibility of making a change or switching gears on this. We said before, just from a pure reading of the rules, it doesn't make any sense at this point. Kyrie Irving should be able to play regardless of where things started, what his decisions were at a different point in time. This is where we are now. And I think that's the one piece that you can go back and talk about where were things at the start of the season, decisions that were made then, responsibilities of Kyrie or of the Brooklyn Nets or of Adam Silver and of the NBA and of the city. All of those things existed then, but the ability to absorb new information and adjust your perspective, your opinion, your rules, your standards, your practices accordingly needs to be something that is afforded. We'll leave that there. We'll turn our attention over to the standings, what the Brooklyn Nets can look to accomplish here. And then again, a historic reference point that could be something that Brooklyn Nets fans can hang their hats on as we move our way towards the playoff picture. But before we do, of course, got to tell you about our friends over at Bet Online. That's because you know the time of year. It is March Madness as college basketball tournament is finally upon us. The seeding just got locked into place there. From the latest odds, contests, and player props, betonline.net is the number one source for all your sports betting needs and information. BetOnline remains the best spot for your sports scores, podcast, and news this season. And it's not just basketball, friends. As we told you before, BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. You can head on over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Okay, so as we've also said, we knew that, and Kevin Durant mentioned this in his post-game comments, didn't know that Curry wasn't going to be available until they announced the starting lineups. So that was a last-second decision from the coaching staff. The ankle listed as day-to-day, not considered to be serious. Steve Nash said he would anticipate Seth Curry being available for the game against the Orlando Magic. But as I said on the last episode, because you're going to have Kyrie on the road there, not disparaging the Orlando Magic, but they are the Orlando Magic. So I am in effect disparaging them. It's not a matchup where you feel like you could go down there with the exact same lineup that you took on the Knicks with Kevin Durant, no LMA, no Kyrie, no Seth Curry, and still feel like, hey, this is a game we need to go out, dominate, and win, even if it takes a big performance like we saw from Kevin Durant. So in this instance, when you look over at the schedule and where the Brooklyn Nets are going to be headed here, coming off of that game over the Knicks, now the Orlando Magic on the road, we know they then come back and will have the home slate of games, which will involve them taking on the likes of Dallas, the likes of Portland, and that's where it matters most to have Seth Curry available because you won't currently have Kyrie Irving on the floor for you. So if that's the case, I would exercise caution. This is the time of year. We said it before. We know when you go back and look at this schedule, and the Orlando Magic are 5-5 over their last 10 games. But when you go back and look at the schedule and say Nets lost some games against teams they shouldn't have, that's all fine and well. But you're at the point in the season where you need to be locked in. You need to be dominating teams that you should be beating or doing whatever is necessary, like against the Knicks, to get that win. Likewise for the Orlando Magic, and even in that spectrum, the Orlando Magic are not the New York Knicks. Let's put it that way. The Knicks have at least been playing better of late. So if you get past the Orlando Magic, then you get the 3 home games with Dallas, Portland, and then the last one being Utah before you get a 2 game, road trip against the Grizzlies and the Miami Heat, and then back home for another 3-game stretch against Charlotte, Detroit, and the Milwaukee Bucks. Get away with it if you can. Get him healthy if you can. Still no update around the hip impingement when it comes to LaMarcus Aldridge, and still no update around Ben Simmons. And this is Doug said I had to hold him to it, hold myself to it. Not going to speculate. Ben Simmons is going to be joining the Brooklyn Nets on this road trip that has been joining them on this road trip. I should say he's staying with them there. We don't know. Had the home game, going to have some road games. He's going to join them. He's with the team. We don't know. Until he steps on the court and is playing, until he gets announced in the starting lineup, there's no point to speculate it. Same thing when it comes to any of these other injuries, not just because sometimes the timelines can be tricky, but because the Brooklyn Nets can be tricky in terms of how they provide that information. But when we look inside of these standings now, it does become interesting because originally we were talking about looking at the standings and saying, well, where do the Nets need to rise to here to overtake the Toronto Raptors? Now, since then, the Toronto Raptors have been going on a little bit of a winning streak of their own, making it certainly a little bit more difficult here for the Brooklyn Nets to find a path into the 7th seed. But simultaneously, the Cleveland Cavaliers have been dealing with some of their own struggles and therefore creating this weird window where we could actually look at this opportunity to say, could the Brooklyn Nets end up in the 7th seed because the Toronto Raptors leapfrog the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Cavaliers continue to tumble? So inside the standings right now, as we talk about, Cleveland Cavaliers are 3-7 over their last 10. They sit a game above the Toronto Raptors and obviously a full 3.5 games above the Brooklyn Nets right now. Going forward here, though, Cleveland has a stretch of games here, 4 games at home, actually 5 games, excuse me, a big 5-game homestand for them that kicks off after they just lost back-to-back at Miami and on the road in Chicago. The Clippers, the 76ers, the Nuggets, before maybe a soft landing spot, you could say, with the Detroit Pistons, and then the Los Angeles Lakers before they head on the road to take on the team right behind them, currently in the standings, the Toronto Raptors. This could be, with what they're dealing with from an injury standpoint, a situation where they now lose 5 in a row before they get to the Detroit Pistons. Dropping 3 more games right now would be significant for them, especially when you turn your attention over to Toronto's schedule, who, before they meet up with them, will play some common opponents, by the way. Lakers and Clippers on the road on a West Coast swing, come back home to take on the Lakers, and then they'll be on the road against the Philadelphia 76ers and against the Chicago Bulls. The point being is, Cleveland is primed to take a bit of a stumble here. When you look back at what the Toronto Raptors have done over their last handful of games after they lost 3 straight, which included bad games against Detroit, against Orlando, and then Cleveland, but then they went on the winning streak against the Spurs, the Suns, and the Denver Nuggets. If they are to go potentially over this next 5-game stretch before they see the Cleveland Cavaliers in what could be critical either way, we could be rooting against both these teams now and then picking one to really be diehard for when that matchup comes up on March 24th. But over the next 5 games, they can go 2-3. They can lose to Chicago, lose to the 76ers. They can split with the Lakers potentially. They can lose. They could go 1-4 over this stretch. Could they win these games? Yes, because you can't take anything away from the fact that they have been playing better basketball and did take games off of quality Western Conference teams. But if they go 2-3 here, and we turn our attention back to what it means to be the Brooklyn Nets right now and what it looks like for your next 5 games, starting with Orlando, there is no way past beating Orlando being an absolutely critical game, as just about every game now becomes that for the Brooklyn Nets. But the Dallas Mavericks, that is a tough matchup. You have to find a way to win that, though. Portland at home, you should be able to get that game, even without Kyrie Irving. And then the Utah Jazz. There are difficult games here. But if we want to believe that the Brooklyn Nets are capable of winning and dominating in the playoffs, if you have Kevin Durant on the court, you have a chance to win these games. That's what they need to figure out. And that is where Dallas, Portland, Utah, those games become critical to have Seth Curry available as they are at home. We could be turning around, as we just say briefly back here on the playoff picture. We could turn ourselves right back around in 5 games if the Brooklyn Nets perform the way that we think they're capable of, no matter who is available between Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving. Kevin Durant will be available. We could be sitting here and talking about a team that is only a half game out behind those 2 teams ahead of them, not just for the 7th seed, but also for the 6th seed as well. Let's turn our attention to the history on that 6th seed when it comes to the NBA playoffs and ultimately the NBA championship, right after we tell you about our friends over at Rock Auto. Oh, we've been talking to you about these guys for a long time. That's because you know that there is just an endless number of car parts inside your vehicle. So many, I couldn't even bother to count. More than 10, less than a million, somewhere in the sweet spot in between. And I might be a do-it-yourselfer, but I'm also someone that doesn't want to go to the auto parts store, say I need a little tail light bulb for my rear blinker, and then I get a guy walking in the back, knocking the dust off, bringing it out. He punched it into the computer. He looked up the product. Do I trust him fully? Maybe, maybe not. I can look it up right on rockauto.com, make sure I get the right make, year of my car, the right part, and on top of which, I'm going to get a great price over those auto part chains. For example, let's say that you're talking about a Honda Odyssey fuel pump, 353 from a chain store, 216 on rockauto.com. That's just a simple keep more money in your pocket. You know that you're going to be able to spend 30 or 50 or even 100 times more for some parts. Why do it when you can get over to rockauto.com? You can get over on the website right now and use their easy to explore drop down menu, find your car, find all the parts available and the solution for your auto parts needs. As I say, go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the car parts you'll ever need. rockauto.com. Okay, so with this in mind, that these critical games, because I had said on a previous episode, the 27th is when you would see the Brooklyn Nets locked into the 7th seed. Gives a couple more games here, has that head-to-head between Cleveland and Toronto play out. I think that's where it starts. And then the question mark became, could you catch up on the Cleveland Cavaliers? This is before they had the injuries and before they hit this little bit of a snide. Now, all of a sudden, they're right in there in that range when you look. Toronto obviously winning your 3 in a row doesn't help you in the short term, but it feels like it's all out ahead of you. And that's where I think that the 6th seed is a possibility for the Brooklyn Nets. Now, we know you want to avoid the play-in as it's constituted right now because you'd be going to Toronto. You wouldn't be able to have Kyrie Irving for that game. If you were to lose it, you deal with having to obviously play the winner of the 9-10 combination. But whether or not it's officially the 6th seed, only once has a 6th seed won the NBA title. And you go back to 1995 and the Houston Rockets. Now, the interesting thing is actually some ties here that I thought were fun taking a look at. No 8th seed has ever gone on to win the championship, although there have been some historical 8 seeds that upset number 1 seeds, something theoretically that the Nets could be in the boat looking to do as well. 2007, Golden State beating the Dallas Mavericks. And then also in 2011, you had Memphis beating the San Antonio Spurs. So some upset specials are certainly possible there in the early playoff games. But 1995, when the Houston Rockets ultimately went on to win the championship over the Orlando Magic, it was a year in which they acquired Clyde Drexler midway through the season to pair with Olajuwon and hopefully go on a run, which they were capable of doing. And over the course of that, though, because as we've talked about, those are 2 elite talents. Are they at the same level of a Kyrie Irving and a Kevin Durant? I'll leave that for you to speculate on. But when you talk about who they had to go through in order to get there, it's worth running down the list because the Nets could have to run a gauntlet like this when it comes to the playoff picture. Houston started it out taking on the what was a 5-game series, by the way, the Utah Jazz, who had Malone and Stockton and Hornacek. This is Malone and Stockton 7-8 years into the career in their primes, had to take them on, beat them in a 5-game series 3-2. Then they went on to take on the Phoenix Suns. They had a Danny Ainge on there, more associated with the Boston Celtics and certainly on the backside of his career. But this was Charles Barkley in his prime. This was AC Green in his prime, peak offensive performance. Had to take them on, had to beat them to move on to take on the San Antonio Spurs. And in that series, we were talking about, some of the bigger names, which would be the Admiral David Robinson, obviously. But how about the fact that it had a little known man named Doc Rivers, who will be coaching the Philadelphia 76ers. This is at the back end of his 8-year NBA career, so he's more of a footnote to it. But Avery Bradley wasn't. He was averaging nearly a double-double over those couple of seasons in that run. So you have Avery Bradley, a one-time coach for the Brooklyn Nets, on that roster as well. You had Rodman in his second season in his prime of his career, second season, well into his career. You also had a man by the name Moses Malone, who was also, much like Danny Ainge, on the backside of his career, but hanging on by a thread there. These were all quality teams. These were all teams that had won 60-plus games over the course of the regular season. Now, this is the one time in history that it occurred, but the parallels to the Brooklyn Nets, when you just think about the idea of, as we've talked about, the upheaval, the trade deadline moves, the adding pieces on the buyout market, but most importantly, this idea that we've always talked about. And you can put Kyrie partially into it because he has been playing for away games, but you can add Ben Simmons into this. The timeline for how much runway they're going to have looks dramatically different, but what doesn't look different is adding in high-level talent for a playoff run. And Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant clearly have more than enough continuity. You're not worried about that piece. You may be looking at Ben Simmons and saying, can he be an extra component to what we want to accomplish when it comes to the playoff picture, especially on the defensive end? If he can come in and purely lock down that end of the floor, that can be a big launching point for Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving carrying this team on the offensive side of the basketball. I don't know what's going to happen over the remainder of this schedule. I know that the enormous win over the Philadelphia 76ers, coupled with some epic performances from Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant in and around that big win over the 76ers, certainly starts to move us in the direction where it feels like this team is surging. It feels like everything is starting to trend in the direction of them being a dominant, dangerous force in the playoff picture. And you only need to look back. 1995, Houston Rockets championship, running the gauntlet. Kevin Durant and the Brooklyn Nets and Kyrie Irving will have Giannis in their way, and Joel Embiid, and James Harden, and Chris Middleton, and Drew Holiday, and Jimmy Butler, right? All these guys are going to be there, and Bam Adebayo. Whoever they have to go through, whatever it takes by any means necessary, we can start to, I think, shift our perspective in the direction of what would be equaling the most historic run to a championship title from a seeding perspective, or even outdoing it, depending on if the Brooklyn Nets are able to rise out of the 8th or 7th seed here before it's all said and done. We'll come back in. We'll talk about what should be, what will be a dominant victory over the Orlando Magic. The 4th win in a row is what the Brooklyn Nets are seeking here before coming back for a critical home stretch against Western Conference opponents. And you can, of course, head over to YouTube, where the numbers continue to surge, where the followers, the subscribers, the comments, man, we love it. There's a whole community of conversation happening over there. Now we try to get involved with those as often as possible, but now you guys are doing it together. So we really appreciate that. We appreciate you listening wherever you get the podcast as well. And in the meantime, friends, as we start to think about what could be possible, dream as if you'll live forever, but live as if you'll die today. James Dean, the actor, not the Sausage King. We'll be back again tomorrow talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.